Hello everyone and welcome to the sky this month for December 2023. My name's Paul Martinaitis and this show is brought to you by the Astronomical Society of South Australia. So we finally made it to the end of the year. Christmas is just around the corner. So that of course means we've got some wonderful summer constellations coming up at the moment. Orion, Canis Major, Eridanus and others as well, which we'll take a more detailed look at, as well of course as our constellation of the month, which this time around is going to be Monoceros, and we're going to look at some of the wonderful objects in that fairly faint constellation just below Orion. The outer planets are also still very well placed for observation, so we'll look at them as well, and in particular we'll focus on a couple of the interesting events that are occurring with Jupiter's moons during December and early January. And there's also the Geminids meteor shower as well next week, if the weather of course is cooperative. So without further ado, let's take a look at the sky for December. So we'll begin our look at the sky as it will appear on the 15th of December at around 11 p.m. So that's about half an hour after the end of astronomical twilight. So we can see at this stage of the year, constellations such as Grus and Pavo are starting to get a little bit low. So now is really your last opportunity perhaps to take a view of the Great Pavo Globular, 6752, and also the Grus Quartet, if you wish. Looking a little bit higher up, however, Sculptor and Cetus and Phoenix are still really very well placed. So now's an excellent opportunity to view the mainly galaxies, many fine galaxies in this region of the sky. And so in last month's show and the November show, we went through a couple of those. So now is still a good time to take a look at those objects. So in the November show, we covered NGC 246, the so-called Skull Nebula. And then moving in a line from Beta Cetus, we looked at NGC 147, a very nice galaxy. Then we moved on to NGC 253, the so-called Silver Coin Galaxy, one of the finest galaxies in the sky, still nice and high, and also the globular NGC 288. So if you haven't had a chance to look at those objects yet, still a good opportunity to do so. And of course, there's many other fine galaxies to look at in this region of the sky as well. So just zooming out a bit, we'll just take a look at where the planets are as well. So it's still a good opportunity, so we'll turn towards the northwest. We can still view the four outer planets quite easily. So let's start with Saturn. So that's starting to get rather low now in the western sky. So really, this is really your last opportunity to get a good look at Saturn. And while you're at it too, enjoy the rings, because when Saturn returns next year, they're pretty much going to be edged onto us, so they'll virtually disappear, and we're just going to see the planet's disk. So now's a good opportunity really to enjoy these rings for this year until their return in a couple of years' time. And of course, while you're looking at Saturn as well, don't forget to keep a lookout for its family of moons as well. So moving along from Saturn, pretty much in a straight line towards Jupiter, which is over there. About here, you'll find Neptune, sort of about a third away along, still nicely placed for observation. Next in line, of course, is Jupiter, and we'll talk much more about Jupiter a little bit later in the show and some of the moon events that you can observe as well. And then finally there's Uranus as well, which is now a little bit past opposition, but still good for observation as well. So it's quite a unique opportunity really, where you can view Saturn, Neptune, Jupiter and Uranus really all in a straight line. Looking to the northeast now, we can see that summer's well and truly underway, because constellations like Taurus, Orion, Canis Major are all well above the horizon now. And there's plenty of also nice bright stars in this part of the sky as well. So, for example, we have the so-called summer triangle, which consists of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, Betelgeuse, the red supergiant, and Procyon in Canis Minor. So they just form the so-called summer triangle or winter triangle for people in the Northern Hemisphere. Then, of course, we have Rigel itself, a rather bright star. And also coming over here, we have Aldebaran as well, which is that bright red star near the head of the bull. And while you're looking in the direction of Taurus, don't forget to keep your eye out for the Pleiades. That's a lovely naked eye object. Beautiful star cluster. So you should be able to see 6 or 7 or maybe more 8 stars with the naked eye under a good sky. And of course, it truly comes to life when you take a look at it through a wide field instrument, such as binoculars. The nebulas you see there, the Merope Nebula, very difficult to see visually. Certainly won't be as bright as you see in that image if you do happen to catch it. But you need a nice dark transparent sky to get a glimpse of it. And of course, while you're in this region of the sky as well, be sure to take a look at pretty much, I think, everyone's favourite, the Orion Nebula, in the Sword of Orion there. It's that little blurry sort of patch that you can see in between those 2 stars above the belt. And here's Monoceros as well, the unicorn, and that's going to be the constellation of the month for December. Very faint constellation, but we're going to look at some of the really fine objects in that constellation a little bit later on in the show. And moving further up, really sort of surrounding the zenith is the river Eridanus, which snakes its way all the way from Orion in the northern sky through to the southern sky, ending in Achernar. Lot of really good galaxies in Eridanus, and also 2 very nice planetaries. So located here is NGC 1535, sometimes called Cleopatra's Eye. We've looked at this a number of times before, but just to remind you, it kind of looks like that through a telescope on a good night, and it really takes, like many planetary nebula, really takes magnification well. And also an oxygen-free filter is of great help in an object like this as well. So be sure to take a look at that. And there's also another really nice planetary in this part of Eridanus. Technically, it's actually in the border in Fornax, NGC 1360, called the Robin's Egg sometimes, or the Fabergé Egg Nebula. And you can see that this one, compared to Cleopatra's Eye, is quite a bit bigger. So I'm just going to back that off. So this simulates how big it would be in a 12-inch telescope at about 65 times magnification. So unlike most planetaries, this is one where you really want to back the magnification off and try it with a filter and without a filter. Without the filter, it'll be a lot fainter, but you can sometimes pick up some of this lovely blue colour without the filter, and then try it with the filter to see whether some more detail comes forth. So finally, looking in the southern part of the sky, we can see that looking over to the left here towards the southeast, the Argo Navis constellations, Carina, Puppis, Vela and Pyxis, they've been very low for the last couple of months, some parts of them below our horizon. They're now starting to come up again, so that's something to look forward to as the months roll on. Puppis, of course, being just below Canis Major, is already quite well placed. Lovely open clusters and planetaries in Puppis to take a look at. Moving a little bit over to the right, Dorado, Reticulum and Horologium, pretty much at their best place for the year at the moment, at this time of the evening. So take advantage of that to take a look at the mainly galaxies in that part of the sky. Speaking of Dorado, we have the Large Magellanic Cloud, which in and of itself is a fine object, particularly in binoculars or some sort of wide field instrument. And then, of course, you can look at it in more detail and pick out objects such as a Tarantula Nebula and many fine little open clusters and nebula in the Large Magellanic Cloud. And then over to the right we have the Small Cloud and everyone's favourite globular cluster, 47 Tuc, nearby as well. So we'll now take a look at the calendar for December. So we can see on the 1st of December, nights start fairly late now. So these times are daylight savings time for Adelaide. So darkness began at about 10 o'clock, 21:59, and went through to 4:11 in the morning. By the end of December, darkness will begin at 22:18 and go through to 4:17 in the morning. Of course, the solstice was on the 21st of December, so as we roll into January and so on, the nights will then gradually get longer again. So the dark sky period where the moon won't interfere began on the 1st of December and goes right through pretty much to the 16th of December, so a good half of the first half of the month. You could stretch it a little bit if you're prepared to begin your observations after midnight. So the moon phases, last quarter was on the 5th, new moon will be on the 13th, first quarter will be on the 20th, and full moon will be on the 27th. So looking at the solar system, in terms of the inferior planets, Mercury begins as an evening object in December, and then Venus as a morning object. And then as the month progresses, Mercury will move in conjunction with the Sun, therefore be unobservable by about the 21st of December. And then towards the end of the month, it will re-emerge again from late December through to January, and it's going to join Venus as a nice morning object. Mars, of course, not only is it now quite far away from us, but it's really behind the Sun during December and extremely close to it during January, and therefore unobservable at the moment. So swinging around to take a look at the outer planets, and like we saw before, they're all really in a lovely line for us, and you can see why that is if we look towards the planets from the Earth's perspective. So we can see over to the right here we have Saturn, sort of in the setting first in the evening sky, so probably your last good opportunity to take a look at Saturn until next year. Neptune. Then we have Jupiter, still very well placed, not far from opposition, still quite close to us, so still has a large apparent size. And then finally we have Uranus there on the left. So as we've seen, this time of year is an excellent opportunity still to take a look at Jupiter. So in addition to the planet itself, the moons, the four brightest moons, the so-called Galilean moons, Io, Europa, Callisto and Ganymede, form like a miniature solar system, and we can actually observe lots of little events that are as they make their way around, orbit around Jupiter. So for your convenience, I've provided a list of these events which are visible from Adelaide. So some of the events that are interesting are occultations. So that's when the moon moves behind the disk of Jupiter. We have transits, which are when the moon moves in front of Jupiter's disk. Perhaps more interestingly, we also have shadow transits, which are where the shadow of the moon is projected onto Jupiter's surface, and we can actually see the shadow of the moon move across as a little black dot. And we also have eclipses as well, which are probably the most spectacular event. So that's where a moon either moves into or out of the shadow of Jupiter. And so from our perspective, the moon will appear to fade very rapidly and disappear, or it'll basically suddenly appear out of the blackness around Jupiter. So they're the four main events we can observe. So you can use this list to plan for them. So bear in mind the times here are in Adelaide daylight savings time. And only the events that are visible from Adelaide are listed. So that is Jupiter must be above the horizon, and also it must be after sunset and before sunrise. And I've also provided an altitude that Jupiter is during that event. So that enables you just to see, whether it's worthwhile observing. So of course, 40 degrees is pretty much 42 is pretty much as high as it will get. If it's running around 5 degrees, well, that means it's going to be really close to the horizon. And for our international friends and even those who are interstate, I've also provided another version of this file in universal time. So all events are listed here, whether they're visible or not for Adelaide. The times are in universal time. Just please note that the altitudes are for Adelaide. So if you're not in Adelaide, those altitudes aren't really applicable. But being in universal time, you can then convert these to your own local time zone to see whether it's convenient for you to view them. So just to give you an idea of what to expect, this is a fairly well-placed transit of Io that will be occurring on the 19th of December. And just bear in mind, these times are just predictions, so sometimes they will be spot on, sometimes they could be out by as much as 10 to 15 minutes. So it's always wise to begin your observation about 15 to 20 minutes before the event time listed, just to be sure that you're going to catch it. So this is a shadow transit, so you'll see that we're looking at how Jupiter will appear on the 19th, and the time is around 8:30. So at this time, the shadow transit hasn't begun, but Io is pretty much mid-transit. So it might be quite hard to pick up because the contrast between Io and Jupiter's surface will be fairly low. But you should be able to just spot it at high magnification. And then as time rolls on, I'll just lock onto it. As time rolls on, there we are at 2038. You'll see there the shadow has just started to appear on the disk. We'll roll time on further, and of course it's getting darker by this stage. So you can see at this point the shadow is pretty much halfway across the disk, and the planet itself, the moon itself, Io, is just near the edge of Jupiter. This would now be the end of the transit because Io has just appeared to leave the disk of Jupiter. The shadow is trailing behind it, and then finally, if we roll on some more past 10 o'clock, so by about 10:30 or so, we can see the shadow has finally left as well. So that sort of gives you an idea of what to expect in it with just a standard shadow transit. And as an added bonus, you can see that the Great Red Spot has come up as well. So that'll be a really nice time to observe Jupiter on the 19th, assuming, of course, the weather is cooperative and it's not too cloudy. So as you can see on that list of events, there's a lot of occurring with the moons of Jupiter. So I've just provided 6 highlights from December and going into January as well, of some of the best events that you may want to particularly take a look at. So there's a couple of Io transits. So we just took a look at the 19th one, the one on 19th of December, just before. There's a shadow transit and a double eclipse on the 3rd of January, which should be really interesting, and it's quite rare to have that many events occurring at once. There's a Europa transit on the 10th, another Io shadow transit on the 11th, and an eclipse involving Europa on the 19th. So there's some of the, and I've listed the times, Adelaide times here, roughly where those events where they begin and end. But please look at that detailed list of events to see all of the details. And of course, there's other events as well that are not listed here. So on the 3rd of January, there's that double eclipse as well as a shadow transit. So I wanted to show you a simulation of this event just to see what to look out for if you're less experienced at observing these type of events, and to encourage you to get out to go and view it as well. It's a fantastic opportunity. So let's hope the clouds and the weather are cooperative. That's probably the main limiting factor. So this shows you Jupiter at around 9 p.m. on the 3rd of January. So at this time, sky is still quite bright because it's just near sunset. So it might be quite hard to pick out Europa. So that's already in transit across Jupiter's surface, but the contrast between Europa and Jupiter will be quite low. And then as time marches on, Europa will make its way across to the edge of Jupiter. And so pretty much as Europa leaves the edge, its shadow will enter on the other side. So that's the beginning of the shadow transit. So you can enjoy that for a while. And then, perhaps more spectacularly, you need to keep an eye on Ganymede, because Ganymede is about to move into the shadow of Jupiter and become eclipsed. And that will occur at around 10:30. So I would start keeping a very careful eye on Ganymede around 20 past 10 or so. And then you'll find over a very short amount of time, maybe a minute, maybe 30 seconds, as it moves into the shadow, it'll sort of disappear suddenly. So at this point, we're only left with two visible moons, Callisto and Europa. So both Ganymede and also Io are currently eclipsed and therefore not visible. So time will roll on, so you've got a bit of time to enjoy the shadow transit. And then what's going to happen is around 11:45, Io is going to come out of eclipse. So as you sort of get towards 11:45, keep an eye on the right side where you saw Ganymede disappear, and Io will suddenly burst into flames again, so to speak. So we'll just advance time. So there's 11:30. So the shadow transit's almost made its way all the way across the disk. And then suddenly Io will reappear at around 11:45. The shadow transit will then end as Europa's shadow exits Jupiter's disk. And finally, keep your eye on Io, or that region around Io, because around 20 minutes past midnight, Ganymede, which went into eclipse before, that's going to reappear as well. And there you have it. And again, that's going to occur quite quickly. So make sure you're looking at that region of the sky a bit before when you think that event's going to occur. So that's a really great opportunity to see a transit, a shadow transit, and two eclipses as well. So for December, we're going to take a look at Monoceros, a wonderful constellation, not so much because of the stars themselves, which are relatively faint, but some of the really great objects that are in this constellation. So Monoceros, the unicorn, unfortunately consists of some fairly faint stars. So for example, Alpha Monoceros is 3.9, which is not too bad. But then by the time we get to Beta, we're looking at 4.6. So under a suburban sky, it can be very hard to pick out, or impossible, depending on how bad your light pollution is. And under a dark sky, the problem is, although you can see the stars, it's hard to pick them out and distinguish the constellation from the background stars around it, because they can be of similar brightness. So Monoceros is really in plain sight, under Canis Major and Orion. And in fact, if we consider that so-called summer triangle of Sirius, Betelgeuse and Procyon, Monoceros is pretty much in the middle of that triangle. So that's a good way to make sure that you're looking in the right part of the sky. So the first object we want to take a look at is in fact a triple star, and that's Beta Monoceros, which you'll find at this point in the constellation. Kind of one way you might consider finding it is perhaps trace out a line between Betelgeuse and Sirius, and it's sort of roughly, to my eye, about 2/3 of the way along that line, and that should take you to Beta Monoceros. So when you take a look at Beta Monoceros through the telescope, you shouldn't have any difficulty separating out the components. You have a closer pair separated by around 7 arc seconds, and then a component further out at around 10 arc seconds. And they're all roughly the same magnitude as well, within a magnitude. So they'll appear very similar in brightness. And to my eye, they sort of have a bluish, whitish colour. And they're set in a very spectacular part of the sky as well. So now we'll take a look at our next object, and that's the Rosette Nebula. And you'll find that down here. So probably the best way to locate that may be to start at Betelgeuse. So I'll sort of put the Telrad on them. We'll move in a little bit closer. Start at Betelgeuse, make your way down to Epsilon, and then you'll find the Rosette just a little bit further along, about 2 degrees further along. And it's inside this triangle part of Monoceros as well. So this is a really great nebula. It does require nice dark skies. So firstly, if you look at it under a suburban sky or under less than optimal conditions, it actually has got a star cluster in the middle called NGC 2244, and you can kind of see it in that photo there. It forms two arcs of very bright stars. So they're sort of two arcs of stars, and they're kind of curved in towards each other. So if you see that pattern, you know that you're looking in the right spot. So when I first looked at this object from my backyard in metropolitan Adelaide, I could see the pattern of stars, but there was absolutely no trace of the nebula whatsoever. So the star cluster itself is worth looking at, but even better under a dark sky, of course, we can see this beautiful reef of gas surrounding those stars. And in fact, it's the radiation from these newly created extremely hot type O stars that have actually blown this hole in the middle of the nebula that you'll be able to see. So this nebula is relatively faint without a filter, even through, say, my 12-inch telescope under a dark sky. It's quite faint without the filter, but once you slip an O3 filter into the train, it really lights up. And it kind of looks almost like a faint version of this black and white photo that you can see down on the left there. So that gives you a better impression of what you can see through the eyepiece. And in particular, on a really good night, you can even see some of these dark streaks. And one more thing to note about this nebula, just if we look at the size here, that's 80 arc minutes by 60 arc minutes. So it's over a degree in diameter. So to appreciate it, you do need to use nice low magnification, probably perhaps the widest field eyepiece that you've got for your telescope. So our next object is a special treat for Christmas, and that's the Christmas tree cluster. So we've got this grouping of 3 stars here. We have Epsilon Monoceri, so we then move down to 13, and finally down to 15 Monoceri. And this is in fact at the base of the Christmas tree cluster. So those of you who've looked at the December edition of the ASSA Bulletin, of course, will see a lovely photograph of this cluster on the front of the bulletin. So when you look at it through the eyepiece, there's 15 Monoceri, and it forms a lovely sort of lopsided triangular shape. So you can see where it certainly where it gets that Christmas tree name from. And also you can see in the photo there's this nebulosity associated with it as well. So it makes for beautiful photographs. Visually, the nebulosity is very, very hard to detect. You need a nice dark transparent sky, and preferably some sort of filter, such as a high contrast, ultra high contrast filter. And right at the top of the tree is the famous Cone Nebula, which is a feature that's often photographed, but notoriously difficult to pick up visually. Generally, a hydrogen beta filter is best for that. I've tried several times with my 12-inch, and although I can generally see the Horsehead Nebula on a good night without too much trouble, even though it's relatively faint, I've never been able to detect the Cone Nebula. But people have, so certainly worth trying as a challenge. So our next object is Hubble's Variable Nebula, or NGC 2261. So currently we're looking at 15 Monoceri, and we're just going to move up about 1.5 degrees to this location here. So you can probably find it just using your Telrad by just moving from 15 Monoceri to this portion here. So this is a really interesting nebula. It's called Hubble's Variable Nebula. The nebula itself wasn't discovered by Hubble, but he was the first one to observe the fact by looking at photographic plates where the exposures had been taken over several months and years, that the nebula actually changed appearances. So it's one of the few deep sky objects where we can see changes over a human timescales. So in the case of this nebula, changes can be observed over weeks to months. And this is a GIF taken from the Wikipedia entry. Very interesting, and that shows you exposures that have been combined from many different amateur telescopes, and it shows you the brightness and the general ripples going across the nebula over several months a few years ago. So really interesting from that point of view. And it's also interesting just as a visual object. So what you'll see is a fairly bright star at the tip, which is R Monoceros. Well, you can't see the star itself, but it's surrounded in dust. But you'll see the glow from R Monoceros, which is responsible for lighting up the nebula. And then coming away from that star, it looks like a sort of a fan, almost like a large fat sort of comet tail, sort of fanning away from it. So it's a very interesting object to look at. And if you're keen, it might be worth even sketching it and then perhaps looking at it a month or two later and see whether you notice any changes in its appearance. And it's also, of course, a great imaging target from that perspective as well. Our final object for Monoceros is M50, which is a beautiful, rich, open cluster consisting of about 150 stars, wide variety of magnitudes, from pretty bright to quite faint, and a few coloured reddish stars in there as well. So really, and it's set in a lovely field as well. So well worth having a look at while you're looking at these more obscure objects in Monoceros. And to find it is relatively easy as well. So we'll just go back here. So this is where the Hubble's Variable Nebula is. And I'll just zoom out a little bit. So M50 is over here. So it's a little bit away in no man's land, so to speak. But perhaps one way to find it would be to draw a line between Alpha and Beta Monoceros. And it's about a third of a way along that line. So that's probably a good way to find it. Another way of finding it might be to start at Sirius, then hop over to Theta, and then if you hop another 6 degrees or so down, you should be in about the right spot as well. So so a lovely part of the sky. So I hope you enjoyed those objects in Monoceros. Thank you very much for watching the show. I hope you found it interesting and informative. Thanks for joining me throughout the year as well. I've really taken great pleasure in preparing and presenting these shows for you. And I look forward to seeing you next year. So I wish you a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year. I hope you have a safe and happy holiday period with your friends and family, and also get some nice clear weather so you can get to do some observing. So until next year, bye for now.